Okay, let's talk about Romanticism. Romanticism is a literary, political, social, musical, artistic movement that happened both in Europe and in Britain. Started around 1720 and ended around 1832. Those dates are arbitrary. You can add or subtract probably a decade either way to actually get the influences of it. Succinctly defined, I would say that Romanticism was an escape from the constraints of civilization, reason, rationality, and law. The easiest way to think of Romanticism is to think of the 20th century equivalent, which was the hippie movement in the 1960s. I probably might want to modify this a little bit and say that not only it was an escape from, but a rebellion against the constraints of civilization, reason, rationality, and law. So it's a very appealing movement in some ways and very dangerous in others. And what the argument was basically is that you, as an artist and as a human being, you had to transcend or escape all of the negative influences that society put on you. The inheritor of Romanticism, I think, in the 20th century is Sigmund Freud, whose book Civilization and Its Discontents basically argues that human beings are fundamentally unhappy because of the constraints that civilization puts on us, and that if we could only release ourselves from these constraints, we would be much happier people. So, in some ways, that makes sense. I mean, if you want to think, for example, about gay or transgendered people who are struggling with the problem of when and how to come out, they they are still discriminated against, and the castigation and the judgment that they are subject to when they come out is a deterrent and keeps them basically locked inside themselves. That is a social pressure that needs to be escaped from and resisted. And so the spirit of Romanticism encourages them to be themselves, their authentic selves, as Sartre would say, and to push back and not let society control you. So, in that sense, Romanticism is a beautiful, liberating opportunity, a channel for us to fulfill ourselves in any way that we see fit. The dark side of Romanticism is, as you'll see from Blake's writings, is that they are also advocating a complete yielding to any impulse that we have, whether that impulse is violent or aggressive or sexual, that we need to stop resisting those impulses. Freud would call it the id, and simply unleash those things. So how do you get rid of your inhibitions, the constraints that society puts on you? Well, here are some of the ways. Number one is we'll see hallucinogenic drugs, in particular opium, which was readily available during the Romantic period. And sometimes they mixed it with gin, and it was called laudanum. Not sure how to spell it. Laudanum, there it is. So you both sort of got high and calm at the same time. The second way would be to immerse yourself in the natural world. And this was inherited from a philosopher by the name of Edmund Burke, who wrote a book called On the Sublime and the Beautiful. And in this text, Burke defines the sublime as a combination of fear and pleasure together. And the two intensities liberate us. So, for example, you might find that in nature. I don't know if you've ever been to Niagara Falls, but if you are behind the railing standing right over the edge of Niagara Falls looking straight down, that is an exhilarating feeling. It is a joyous and exhilarating experience to to have, but at the same time you're terrified that you might fall over the edge. That's the sublime. The spirit of romanticism manifests itself in other ways. The American Revolution in 1776, the French Revolution through Napoleon, 1803 to 1815, and as we'll see later, the revolution in Greece as well, which was a fight for democracy. Other thinkers like Keats escaped into the ideal world of things perfect, the kind of Platonic form of things. Poets like Blake immersed themselves in mythical and biblical stories that were cosmic and larger than human beings. Another aspect of romanticism is peering into the dark side of the self. John Polidori, who was the physician to Lord Byron and Mary Shelley and a few romantic writers, very famously in Switzerland one summer, along with the whole crew of them, ended up doing an awful lot of opium. And out of those dark visions emerged the first vampire story in the English language, 1816, and also Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818. Political rebellion against authority. Again, Lord Byron, another Greek poet, dies in Greece fighting for democracy. The Romantics are very concerned about dreams and the unconscious mind. Nightmares in particular are things that come up that we can't control. Again, highly connected to the Freudian id. Also foreshadowing the hippies, Byron Coleridge and Mary and Percy Shelley were seriously considering moving to America to live together communally, to have sex communally, to live off the land. That really sounds like 1968 all over again. So these are different ways that Romantics expressed a desire to escape from the rules of society and at the same time to rebel against them. So what does that look like in terms of ideas? As we'll see with Wordsworth, it means the pursuit of ordinary language. The ordinary people in ordinary circumstances are more important than upper level or upper society socialites or kings and queens and princes or people of status. The ordinary was better. The Romantics had sympathy for anyone who was an outsider or who was alienated or deformed psychologically and physically. They really valued that. Lord Byron himself, for example, had a club foot and walked with a horrible limp, but was still very much a ladies' man. This notion of alienation and deformity also registers in Frankenstein's creature, who is a bit of an abomination because of the way in which Dr. Frankenstein has put together his anatomy. We are to feel sympathy for those outsiders. Coleridge wrote a poem called The Ancient Mariner about a sailor who inadvertently killed an albatross while he was sailing through the South Pole and has been punished by the gods in perpetuity for killing an innocent creature for no reason. And part of his punishment is that he is forced to retell his story over and over and over again, very much like you would experience in post-traumatic stress. And so that alienated outside figure becomes a hero. It's very much alive in a lot of modern movies about detectives who live outside the law and who execute their own kind of justice and so on. A resistance then to all civilized values. Here's an interesting aspect of Romanticism. They explored collaborative writing, Coleridge and Wordsworth in particular. Of course, they kept up with their individual writing, but they were really trying to find ways to, different ways to write. And again, a very sort of egalitarian, anti-individual approach to things. Now look at what William Blake has to say, and this is kind of the spirit of Romanticism. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom, that you must transgress the boundaries of your life in order to be wise. any university student who has overdone work or sleep deprivation, if you've had too much to drink, if you've had too much to smoke, it's very difficult to learn where and when to stop. And so the romantics are encouraging human experience, and you have to go too far. If you look at this, this is also Blake. You never know what is enough unless you know what is more than enough. So romanticism is all about transgression and offending people and going too far in order to learn, and not being hesitant or caught in yourself or worried about what people think or worried about what the law is going to do to you. And again, I come back to one of my overriding themes. You should find the ideas in romanticism both exhilarating on the one hand and terrifying on the other. Look at this also, exaltation in emotion. This is also Blake. Those who restrain desire do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. And so what civilization would normally exult in, you have to control your emotions, you have to control your impulses, you can't punch people in the face just because you feel like it, you can't fart in a lecture theater just because you feel like it, you need to control and restrain yourself all the time. For Blake, that's a weakness. That impulse to control and to follow the rules is a weakness. And so look at this, how he expresses it. Sooner murder an infant in its cradle than nurse an unacted desire. That is to say that infanticide is preferable to repression. So really, really emphasizing this notion of just letting loose and just letting everything rip. Rejoicing in the feminine in a culture that was masculine gets expressed in all kinds of ways. Female beauty, feminine attributes, such as collaboration. These are all stereotypical, I understand, but collaboration, cooperation, nurturing, all of those sorts of traits the romantics cherish. They also rejoice in human sexuality. The nakedness of woman is the beauty of God. The lust of the goat is the beauty of God. That our sexuality is divine and not something to be repressed. If you go right back to the Renaissance, in spite of the fact that the Renaissance was driven by humanism, it's very clear that, especially in Catholicism, the body is to be punished. And so, for example, during Lent, you abstain from certain things in order to purge desire and the weaknesses of the flesh. The monks in the monasteries of the Renaissance used to flagellate themselves with whips in order to literally beat desire out of themselves and not to give in to hunger and thirst and sexual desire and all of those things that make us human. I'll talk about this separately, but this is Wordsworth, committed to the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. When you create something, whether it's music or poetry, don't stop yourself, don't put any restraints on it. Just basically, if you'll forgive the metaphor, stick your finger down your throat and whatever comes up, just spew it out and get it out there and then work with it. Making the unfamiliar the exotic, so pursuing unusual things and dark things. Democracy here, all men are alike in poetic genius. Anybody can be a genius. It isn't something that the elite would aspire to. Here's another perverse thing from Blake. If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. So if you get really stupid enough, you actually become smart. And the idea here is that our sense of wisdom comes from social constraint. I'm going to skip Hellenistic and Judaic law for now, but I will talk about this notion here from Rousseau. Rousseau is the author who comes up with this idea of the noble savage. That is to say, what Rousseau did was he looked at the relationship between human nature and society, and he came to the conclusion that if you took human beings out of society, theoretically, if you could take us out of society and raise us as children, without social constraints. We would be noble and beautiful. It's only civilization that corrupts. And clearly this is what Mary Shelley did in Frankenstein, because Frankenstein's creature, when he first comes into conscious existence, is benign and loving and caring. And every time that creature has contact with civilization, he is cut, hurt, injured, humiliated, damaged, punished in some way, so that he eventually learns to become cruel and vicious and eventually a murderer. And so for Rousseau, indigenous peoples all around the world, for example, who were untouched by European culture, were more noble and closer to God and closer to Eden and Adam and Eve than civilization. Again, a very highly romantic idea. So what we have in regular sort of mainstream hegemonic civilization and society is a series of power structures or preferences where the one on the left is privileged and the one on the right has been marginalized or degraded or subordinated. So for example, civilization over the primitive. Think of Columbus and other Europeans dominating indigenous peoples in North and South America and controlling them and thinking that they were basically inferior entities. Even the Catholic Church sent the Jesuits into Canada to save the souls of First Nations peoples in the arrogant belief that without Christianity they would go to hell. White over black, this has to do with race. The preference of white European everything, white European women, men, culture, inventions was all superior to black and brown skinned inventions and so on. Teacher over student was authority over subordination, reason over passion, that you had to control your emotions. Community over the individual, old over young, beauty over deformity, written language over oral, male over female, parent over child, head over heart, order over chaos, science and technology over nature, normal over abnormal. And all the romantics do is they take the left-hand side of this table and flip it over and move the left to the right and the right to the left, so that the primary now becomes this, not what was on the left side. And so they invert all of these different power structures. There are a lot of romantic personalities. This particular one is William Blake. It's from one of his works, but anyways, The Dance of Albion. You can see here three sort of mystical figures confronting this figure who's reaching out to them. There are suppliants here. It's hard to sort of decode what this picture is about, except to say that it looks like some kind of vision or nightmare where this person is being visited by these three entities who seem in part to be afraid, but also angry at this person. There are others here. This is also Blake. This one is called The Blasphemer. Blasphemy, speaking against heterodoxy or orthodoxy and challenging it. And you can see that this figure in the middle, the blasphemer, is really quite heroic. You can see that he is muscular, and even though he is restrained, he's kind of magnificent in his resistance. There was a text by Shelley called Prometheus Bound, and in that story, also again very romantic, as Prometheus is one of the demigods who decides to give man fire, and in that process is punished, and so every 24 hours he is tormented in the daytime, and he has vultures pick at his liver, and then overnight it grows back and they come back at him again. It's a guy named De Quincey who um, wrote a text called, sorry, who wrote a text called Confessions of an Opium Eater in 1821. And in that confession, it's very interesting because he says here, as he begins his piece, guilt therefore I do not acknowledge. So he has no shame in how he's lived his life as an opium addict. And if I did, it is possible that I might still resolve on the present act of confession in consideration of the service which I may thereby render to a whole class of opium eaters. And he's writing for other opium eaters, so he is unashamed of the constraints and the judgment that society would put on him as a drug addict. Here's a quote from Napoleon that expresses his romantic side. I, a royal maggot, I am a soldier. I come from the people. That's the impulse of democracy, or better, or inverting sort of the normal order of things. I have made myself. I am a self-made man. And here, look at this ferocious independence. I listen to everybody, but my own mind is my counselor. So for Napoleon, he's really all about the rise of a ferocious individuality that is not going to succumb to any social pressure at all. Look at this one from Lord Byron, who died in Greece fighting for the Greek Revolution. This is just an excerpt from his poem that he wrote on his 36th birthday. He said, the sword, the banner, and the field, glory and Greece around us see. The Spartan born upon his shield was not more free. Awake, not Greece, she is awake. Awake my spirit. So Greece is already risen to the challenge of democracy. I myself need to wake up and to not be afraid to shed blood in this revolution against tyranny. So like Napoleon, Byron is expressing this political freedom, again, a sense of rebellion. On the music side of things, it's very interesting also because there were a lot of composers, especially Beethoven and Wagner, for example, who were breaking the rules of music. And in particular, I've got some links here that you'll be able to follow, but in particular, there was a rule, a law of music theory against something called the devil's interval. And if you actually wrote music with these notes in it, you could be executed. In other words, you could be put to death for playing wrong notes. Now, I've got Black Sabbath here also, interestingly enough, because Black Sabbath took this notion of the devil's interval and made it part of their music. But Beethoven includes this in a number of his pieces of music. So here, in a normal scale, you have those 8 notes. That's a G scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you can play these notes together, and they sound to our ear harmonious and resonant. Now this interval is called a fourth. It's actually like These Eyes by Burton Cummings and the Guess Who, if you know it. And this interval is called a fifth, which is not dissonant. But here is the devil's interval. It's from the root, it's called an augmented fourth or a flat fifth. And that dissonance was thought to belong to the devil. So if you actually played that or wrote music that had that, you were considered to be satanic and inviting the devil into your life. And so what romantic musicians are doing is breaking the laws of music and harmony in order to express their rebellion against the constraints of civilization and its rules of music. In terms of art, this is Fuseli. He's a very famous artist. This is Napoleon meeting his judgment. It's got to do with the dark side of human nature, as I said before, and the supernatural and the unconscious mind. It's kind of like a dream, reminiscent, it seems to me, of both Macbeth being visited by ghosts, and by Richard III, who is visited by the ghosts of all the people that he's killed. More famously, though, this is the painting that made Fuseli famous. It's called The Nightmare. You have three entities in the piece. There is a female who is stretched out, limp. You can see her arm hanging down here, the other arm over here. Her hair is dangling. It's not clear whether she is dead or sleeping. Either way, it's sinister. If she is sleeping, as the title would tell us, and remember that we can often glean meanings from any work of art by the title. So let's say that she's probably sleeping. This creature on top of her here is an incubus, a spirit that is sitting on her chest. And it was thought that if you had trouble breathing at night and you were dreaming, it was because this incubus was sitting on top of you. An incubus was a supernatural creature that visited women. A succubus was a supernatural creature that visited men. And then you've got this bizarre horse head sticking through the window of the bedroom, which is very sort of cryptic. It's not clear whether the horse is a guardian figure. If so, the horse seems to be relatively helpless. It might be a symbol of sexuality. Who knows? But we are left with this feeling of anxiety and angst. And the Romantics actually really sort of glamorized death. There's an old rock and roll saying, live fast, die young, and have a beautiful corpse. That kind of was the romantic notion of life, that you should really live to excess in every possible way. And whenever you die, you make a beautiful corpse, and there's some magical poetry in that. This, if you go to Google Images and type in The Nightmare, you'll see there's all kinds of variations on it. Here's another one. This time the other way, with the female again, asleep or dead, the incubus on top of her, and the horse in the background. So these are all the disturbing images associated with Romanticism, because again, in your dreams, your unconscious mind, all of these dark and forbidden thoughts emerge. So there you have the picture of Romanticism. Of both exhilarating and, in my estimation, terrifying political, psychological, social, artistic, literary movement that has cast a long shadow even into the 20th century with Freud and its civilization and its discontents, and I dare say even into our modern world.